Excellent. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. My name is Paul Gould, and I'm the Head of Partnerships here at ILC, and it is great to welcome you to our report launch of a marathon or a sprint, supported by Bayes Business School. It's an important part of our work, the health work that Les has been doing. The report has been done by Professor Les Mayhew and Ray Algar of Oxygen Consulting, and as I said, this has been supported by Bayes Business School. I'm also delighted that we are welcoming an expert panel to comment on the report. We have Sharron Davies MEP, British swimmer and Olympic and Commonwealth Games medalist, Whittle MSP, British athlete and Conservative Scottish politician, Gemma Curtis, who's the strategic lead on physical activity for health at London Sport, Dr. Dion Neame, North American senior medical expert of vaccines at Sanofi, and Scott Reid, the deputy chair of Diabetes Working Party, the member of the Health and Care Board at the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. The format of this afternoon will be that Professor Les Mayhew will kick off the webinar by sharing the findings of his research. And then I'll be inviting all of our panelists to comment on that, and we will then have some time for questions and answers at the end. In this webinar, we're going to be exploring the impact of professional sport on the longevity of athletes, how different sports fare when it comes to life expectancy and change across the life course, the wider implications of the role of physical exercise in healthy aging strategies, and also the impact of high-level sporting events on grassroots sport and exercise. So before we kick off, a few house rules to go to. Please do use the Q&A feature at the bottom to put your questions to Les and to the panel. In the interest of time, it would be helpful if you could keep those questions short and focused on the topics of today's webinar. If you get disconnected from the webinar, you can just use the same link to come back in. And we're also using Twitter today to put the debate on social media, using the hashtag #SportLongevity and @ILC-UK. Just to let you know as well, this webinar is being recorded and will be published for public access on our website and YouTube channel. So if you don't want to appear on camera, then please do turn your camera off. But thank you to our panelists for joining us, and thank you attendees as well. So without any further ado, I will kick off with asking Professor Les Mayhew to give his findings. Les joined ILC in October 2020 and has worked on a range of ILC research projects, as well as bringing his expertise to our research approach and our strategy. He is also Professor of Statistics at Bayes Business School. Les, can you please kick us off, please?
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, Paul. First, let me welcome our distinguished discussants, and just to say I'm looking forward to hearing their views on this really interesting topic. And thanks to everybody else for tuning into this ILC event. We'd all very much welcome your feedback. I'm Associate Head of Global Research at ILC and Professor of Statistics at Bayes Business School, as Paul mentioned. And this is a joint project between ILC and Bayes, to whom I'm very grateful for their financial support. Now, I'm also an honorary fellow in the Institute of Actuaries. Actuaries are widely employed, as you know, in the pensions and life insurance industries especially. One thing that you need to know is that they're very punctilious. And for example, they like their customers to be dead on time, which is a neat segue into what this research is about. Do elite athletes live longer than the general population? So there's huge interest in longevity today. People can spend fortunes on finding the secret of a long life. But of course, I would maintain that sport is cheaper and much closer to home, but does it do a better job? I hope to show that it does. Next slide, please. So first, a bit more about the research. Our aim is to look at longevity through the perspective of elite sport. Is there a longevity dividend if people spend more time engaging in sport and physical exercise? We know that physical exercise and sport is a route to health and well-being, but it's also good fun. However, little is known if your later years will be healthy years or which sports do best. Sport can be confidence building, something that stays with you for life and opens up opportunity. In our previous research, we found that longevity was boosted in some sports more than others. Tennis and golf, for example, did particularly well, especially because you can partake in both into old age. In this latest research, we set out to determine which branches of athletics and other individual sports do best. We used the Commonwealth Games, which started in 1930, as our basis, about which more in a moment. So does the benefit of doing it when you stay, when you're young, stay with you for life? You must keep it up or not, whatever the case may be. And what do the data provide us with? Any useful clues that we can generalize and use? Secondly, is there a halo effect? Do others benefit from your example because they are fans or devotees of the particular sport? And are there other differences, but for example, between genders and nationalities? And this is what we try to look at here. Next slide, please, Linda. At ILC, we want people to live long and productive lives free from illness and disability. An aging population poses challenges, even though we're living longer, so good health is essential. Next month, for example, we're launching a new index which will rank countries on their health, well-being, prosperity, and environment. Part of our strategy is to shine a light on activities or segments of society with proven links to our mission, which have to do with lifestyles that provide potential role models. And sport is a perfect example of this. Next slide, please. Life expectancy has increased massively. A male aged 20 in 1870 could expect to live to 63 years. Same person born in 1970, it would be 86 years. So our methodology is designed with that in mind. There are two cases to consider. First is people that have already died, and the second is competitors that are alive today but could be of any age. And the question there is, are these ages exceptional or not? Take the first case. Given the huge increases in life expectancy, ages of death may not be representative of the more recently deceased. We correct for this by comparing ages of death with the expected age of death of an average person born in the same year. Our summary statistic compares the average percentile to which these athletes live with the median age of death in the general population for people born in the same year. In the second case, those still alive today, many are living to exceptionally old ages, well into their 90s, for example. We compare those still alive with those we would expect to be alive based on life tables and express one as a ratio of the other. A ratio higher than one means that more are still alive than we would expect, and if less than one, then it's the opposite case. Linda, next slide, please. So our laboratory, as it were, is the Commonwealth Games, chosen because it has a very long history and a range of sports. We focus on medalists for which there are meticulous records covering all events, competitors' names, and countries of origin. Details can be found online in the vast majority of cases, including dates of birth and death, and also brief biographies of most. In 1930, the Games were known as the British Empire Games. Most competitors were men, and events were measured in imperial units, feet, inches, yards, miles, stones, and pounds. Women only competed in aquatics events and had to wait until 1986, for example, before they could run in the marathon. The Games went metric in 1970, and today women compete for more medals than men, such has been their impact. Para events were integrated into the 2002 Games. This chart shows the impressive growth in the Games since it was first held in Canada, Ottawa, Canada, in 1930. The dip you see in 1986 in that chart were the so-called boycott games, when 32 countries withdrew in protest against apartheid. But apart from that year, you see almost continuous growth over the period. To put a scale on it, the Birmingham Games in 2022 featured 5,000 athletes, 72 teams from 54 countries and 18 territories, all competing in 19 different sports. The BBC recorded a TV audience of 28.6 million, the highest ever for the Games, and the global audience is estimated at 1.5 billion people. Next slide, please, Linda. In the next few slides, I feature a few findings and results. If you want to dig much deeper, then we have a report available free online for you to look at in more depth. First, the different categories. This slide shows how we organize the data. A few points. We only count medalists once, even though they may have been successful in more than one event or games. There are 2,688 medalists, male medalists, 1,394 female medalists, 4,082 in total. We don't count people in team sports as they are much harder to track down and change frequently. Moreover, included team sports have changed over time. Take, for example, the inclusion of cricket or rugby, which is not a certainty at all. There are core sports included in every Games, but these are also some of these are discretionary, like synchronized swimming, which only feature once. We've excluded these from our analysis. Some sports are difficult to categorize. For example, we put lawn bowls in with field sports, but cycling is in a category on its own. These slides show how many individual medalists there are in each category. The biggest is contact sports with 726 men and women, which include boxing, weightlifting, and judo. Sorry, I should say 726 men. This allows us to compare medalists across these categories in a statistically valid way. In some large categories, we can go further because the samples are sufficient. For example, we can compare boxing with wrestling or long distance with short distance running events. Okay, let's look at some results. Next slide, please, Linda. So this chart is a way of illustrating the difference in the mortality prospects of medalists and the general population. The chart shows the cumulative mortality of track medalists versus that of the general male population. The black lines show the equivalent deaths we would expect in the male population, and the blue columns show the mortality of our medalists. In this case, this is track medalists. If the blue column showing the actual deaths is lower in height than the black line above it, it indicates a longevity advantage. That is to say, there have been fewer deaths than have been expected. The gap is denoted by the arrow. We can also see this advantage extends right to the top of the percentile range, which is on the horizontal axis. In other words, track medalists always do better than the general population. This is the male population in this case. Indeed, what we see is the mortality of track medalists is lower than expected up to the 99th percentile. In other words, the whole life course. It means that there are several examples in this group that live to very old ages indeed. In this case, it turns out that track medalists have a 25% longevity advantage using our chosen statistic. Okay, let's contrast this sport, this category with another category, that of contact sports medalists. Now, contact sports medalists, as I said, include things like wrestling, boxing, and judo. And what you immediately see here is the gap between actual mortality experience and the general population is considerably smaller. It doesn't extend to the whole life course. At the oldest ages, it's very similar to the general male population. It means that in this particular category, the longevity boost will be smaller, but at least the columns are all below the black line, which shows that it does no worse, but in some cases it does a bit better. In this case, you still get a longevity boost. It remains positive, and it turns out to be 10% compared with 25% in the previous example. My third example, next one please, Linda, is aquatics medalist. This is, of course, mainly swimming, principally. Briefly, very briefly, what's prominent here is that the boost in the lower percentiles is higher than in any other category that we've examined. However, the boost does not extend to the oldest as much as it does for track. It means there aren't as many examples of exceptionally long-lived swimmers, but they do better as a whole. In their case, the overall boost is 29%, which is the highest of all our categories. Okay, so just to summarize, this is all our categories in one slide. Next slide, please, Linda. Here, these horizontal bars here in this chart show the relative advantage of each of our categories compared with the general male population, which is a value of 1 in this chart. That's the top green bar. And what you can see here is that track is boosted 25%, 1.25. Field sports, that's throwing and jumping, and so on, that comes out at 14%. Aquatics 29%, contact 10%, and indoor sports 24%. Now, what you see here is interesting because in the case of cycling, we only get a value of 0.9, which means that it's 10% lower. Cycling is an outlier, and some will be surprised that it does not rank higher and that it falls below the national average. It was plain from the data that competitive cyclists are quite accident prone, not necessarily in the games themselves, but from the intensive training and other exposure that they face. So just a quick obvious point, really, we point out that cycling for leisure does not necessarily expose you to the same levels of risk as long as you're careful, but nevertheless, it's a point to take into account. Next, let's turn to the second part of the analysis, which is concerned with the numbers who are still alive and whether they're people living to exceptional ages. This particular chart shows whether the number alive in any year is exceptional compared with the number alive in the general male population. The vertical scale is the ratio of those alive in a given category, in this case track, with those we would expect to be alive. When the ratio equals 1, there is no difference. It matches the black horizontal line which you see running through the middle of the chart. But above the line, more remain alive than we would expect, and below the line, fewer are alive than we would expect. Now, in all categories except for cycling, the ratio is always higher than 1 above the line. And you can see in this case, it's trending, increasing over time, is now 10% above the average. Now, it will keep increasing before leveling once the process has reached what I call a steady state, but we're not quite there yet. However, in all cases, apart from cycling, it's a very positive tale to tell. Let me sum up now some conclusions. Next slide. So by way of some summary, here's some key findings. Longevity is boosted between 4.5 and 5.3 extra years. I haven't spoken about our female longevity, which we've not disaggregated into different sports because of sampling issues, but their longevity boost is 3.9 years compared with the general female population. But that is across all categories. So if we were able to pick on a particular category, I'm sure we'd find quite similar differences to what we found in men. Now, compared with our previous research, this longevity boost seems to be on a par with golf and tennis. Perhaps physical exertion and the ability to play to a late age may be a common factor here. As I mentioned, cycling has safety issues and interestingly appears to be comparable to horse racing, which we featured in our previous research. These results are consistent broadly with other published studies using different data sources, but those data sources are perhaps narrow in scope. So what we've been able to do here is expand the horizons somewhat in different directions. In a few cases, our sample sizes permit us to drill down a bit deeper. Here we find that long distance races over 3 kilometers boost longevity more than shorter distance races, but find no difference between field events such as jumping and throwing. Next slide, please, Linda. So just a final word, sport has a huge global following and is worth billions to the economy. Elite athletes, of course, are adored by fans. They act as role models and help change behaviours, I would argue. But sport also alters over time. The rules change, but also the financial rewards, training regimes, and governance. So health and longevity is not guaranteed in this sense, but I think as this research shows, it's doing a pretty good job. Thank you for listening.
Les, thank you very much for that. Some very interesting findings in there. And now I'd like to come to our panel for some comments. And first of all, Sharron Davies MBE. Sharron is a British swimmer, Olympic and Commonwealth Games medalist. Probably needs no introduction, really. One of the UK's best known and most popular sportswomen since bursting onto the scene as an Olympian in 1976. Sharron, over to you for some comments, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Les. First of all, good afternoon, everybody. And I'm extremely excited to know that my life insurance will go down. So that's a good starting point. Secondly, I think it's really interesting to know whether this is kind of a learnt behaviour or whether this is something that is innate, you know, that puts the health and fitness in during those competitive years. If I'm honest, I think it's probably a mixture of both. But for me as an athlete, this is a learned behavior. So I've literally just come from the gym now. You know, all my years spent training were, well, nearly 20 odd years of my life, getting up at 5 in the morning and doing 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. And so that is a habit that I learned, and it's still very much part of my life. And it would feel very odd if I didn't do it. So I think that has a great deal to do with the longevity, you know, this ability to have been very fit when you were younger, and then hopefully to have maintained it all the way through your life. And of course, you're more body aware. You know, you've taught yourself to be aware of what exercise, what sleep, what nutrition brings to your life and how positive it is and what are the good things to do and the bad things to do. So these are all absolutely valuable lessons. As far as with regards to swimming, I think it's probably one of those sports that is cradle to grave. And as you mentioned, you know, golf and tennis, these are sports that people tend to play for the rest of their life. And although I don't swim an awful lot these days because it's a busman's holiday and I've got knackered shoulders, which is the other side of being involved in elite sport, I think that it is an activity which absolutely everybody can do. You know, you can do that whether you are pregnant, whether you are old and you are suffering from arthritis, or whether you are very young and you're doing it with a family. So it has huge positive aspects to it. We're struggling at the moment, as I'm sure everybody is aware. We've lost a huge number of pools over the last few years, and it's something in this country which I'm really passionate about, because not only have we lost the ability for people to be able to exercise in a swimming pool, we also have rising death rates from drowning. So it's got to be something that we've got to actually address. Family benefits, I think it also nurtures its way down through to the family. All my kids have been brought up to be fairly sporty, because again, it's what I do. You know, when people say to me, what do your children do? And I say, well, this one does rugby and this one does track and field and whatever. They always go, oh, that's really interesting. And I go, well, if I was a pianist, I expect most of my kids would play the piano. And it is what they actually see. It's what's around them that's contagious. So again, this is about trying to get people to understand that if we can program our children to be healthy and to be fit and to exercise and to eat well, those kind of learnt behaviors will be taken through the rest of their life. And that's probably my sort of main points. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions later on, but I'm just very happy to see that swimming is extremely well represented. And yeah, it would be interesting to know what the actual female figures were, but as you say, probably very similar to the men's.
Thank you, Sharron. Very interesting comments about the learned behaviours. I'm sure we'll pick that up in the Q&A as well. Next, I'd like to come to Brian Whittle MSP. Brian's a British athlete and medalist and politician. Running the 400 metres and 800 metres, he's represented Great Britain 45 times and won medals, including at the 1988 Olympics in Seoul and the 1990 Commonwealth Games in New Zealand. Brian's been a member of the Scottish Parliament for South Scotland since 2016 and served as a Conservative Party spokesman for public health, mental health, wellbeing and sport. Brian, delighted to have you here. Over to you.
So you're thinking I've got the hang of this by now, and you have to unmute yourself before you start speaking.
Everyone does it, Brian. Everyone does it.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm really delighted to be able to speak on a topic that I actually might know something about. Talking all things sport is a very comfortable place to be, especially as it transpires that it looks like I might get a few extra years to annoy my children in my dotage. Now, when I look back at my own athletics career and all the pain and suffering that I put up with, it's gratifying that a byproduct of that is the likelihood that I might live a little longer. Ironic that I spent the decade or so as an international athlete driving myself towards what I felt like were near-death experiences. I also note from the report that track athletes may benefit more than most other sports, which is perhaps responsible for the slightly smug look I currently wear. And I would suggest that my events being 400 and 800 metres, given the intense lactic tolerance work that is required, I do feel that if you survive that kind of regime, your system must be pretty resilient. I also note as well that my second sport, golf, also rates rather highly in extending my life expectancy, so buckle in, I may be around for some time. So I do very much welcome this report, which to my mind kind of backs up what we may logically assume with science. I mean, that logical extrapolation from science that being physically active is of itself life extending. I think the importance of sports participation is something that I have long championed in Parliament, more from the perspective of learning through sport rather than sport, to be honest. Although in developing participation, we increase the opportunities to uncover international sporting potential. Now, there is a number of reasons for this. Obviously, there's the physical fitness angle, which I'm sure most of us would assume. However, as Sharron has said, there is also learned behavioural traits such as discipline, resilience and confidence and aspiration to be considered. The huge connection between physical health and mental health, which I think is so important in a time when there is a mental health epidemic, especially in our younger generation. I think the impact of this learning outside of the classroom has so many repercussions across life chances and outcomes. I think the question is how significant are high-level sporting events to the national health and economic policy. Well, the health budget in Scotland is approaching half the total Scottish government budget, which in my view is completely unsustainable, especially given that Scotland is the unhealthiest nation in Europe. So we can either find a way of treating more patients as medicine advances, or we can reduce the number of people seeking medical interventions in the first place. Preventable health conditions like type 2 diabetes and obesity, some musculoskeletal conditions, 40% of cancers, many mental health conditions should all be in our crosshairs in this regard. In the Health and Sport Committee last term, we did a study which indicated that preventable conditions cost the Scottish economy somewhere north of £30 billion, both in treatment of the conditions and the lost revenue in the economy. £30 billion. And international sporting events such as Commonwealth Games are the shop window. They're a major marketing tool, if you like, a way to connect with the public in a way that so few other tools at our disposal can. But to be effective, governments must create a framework that allows that generated enthusiasm an outlet, and an outlet that gives opportunity to all, irrespective of background or personal circumstances. Unfortunately, I think sport is becoming the sort of bastion of the middle classes, with spiralling participation costs exacerbating inequalities. I think one of the interesting things would be to overlay this study perhaps with the SIMD areas. To me, one of the key solutions is developing the use of the school estate. When a participant has gone home and then have to go somewhere else to play sport, there is a significant drop-off. We must stop waiting for our youngsters to come to sport and start taking sport to them. Sort of fish where the fish are, if you will. Invest in school sports facilities, tie up with what is available in the local communities, use and fund national governing bodies to develop that offer. For our youngsters to do it, they must be able to see it. The starting point might be that spark of enthusiasm ignited by watching sporting heroes do their thing on the international stage. However, the next step has to be easy, so we have that opportunity for that spark to burn brightly. Now, I'm sure that the Scottish Parliament believes that my solution for every issue facing Scotland is to get everyone to go out for a run. Now, I have to say, I don't think that's that far from the truth. Investing in this kind of education, reducing the inequality of opportunity, is investing in the health and well-being of the country. The Commonwealth Games and other such events show the power of possibility. Governments need to make the pathway to aspiration much clearer. That way, many more may just benefit from a few more productive years on this earth. Thank you.
Ryan, that's great. Thank you so much for that. I'd now like to come to Gemma Curtis. Gemma is the strategic lead for physical activity for health at London Sport. As a qualified physiotherapist, Gemma's always been very passionate about improving health and wellbeing through physical activity. And as health lead at London Sport, she helps to maximise physical activity opportunities, working with health partners to achieve London Sport's vision of a healthier and happier city. So Gemma, great to come to you, and also given the fact we had the London 2012 Olympics, there may be some comments from you there on the legacy of those games.
No problem. Thank you very much. I think Brian's touched on a few things that I was going to say, made some great points there, so hopefully it won't be too repetitive. But my initial thought on the report findings were it is well documented that, you know, sport and physical activity have many health benefits and reduce the chances of us getting around sort of 20 avoidable diseases. So, you know, I would expect that athletes competing at really high level, would have those beneficial effects on the longevity of their lives when you consider their health regimes and, you know, fitness levels. But it's also really good to have that, you know, research that actually further evidences the benefits of sport and physical activity. So me speaking with my sort of healthcare hat on. What I found really interesting, what I'd love to know more about as well, is I think some of the quality of life as well that these, you know, the athletes are dealing with afterwards. Sharron touched on sort of shoulders being knackered after years and years of swimming at an elite level. So, you know, I'd be really interested to know sort of, especially higher impact sports as well, are there higher levels of you know, disability maybe as well? Because I think that would be quite interesting in terms of our healthcare system thinking about, you know, living well, aging well, because that's a lot of the focus of the NHS at the moment. So thinking about sort of the legacy of the 2012 Games, there's lots of mixed views on this. We had high hopes of inspiring a generation, and the investment into sport leading up to the Games was amazing to see. We gained new venues, like most of which are still being utilised today. But actual participation isn't exactly, I think, what we expected or where we expected it to be now, 11 years on. So London Sport produced a report which actually looked at the legacy of the Games 10 years on and found that there were mostly positive sort of perceptions of what happened, but the London host boroughs are some of the most deprived in London, and we saw that the same demographic groups remain more likely to be inactive. There were a couple of exceptions in the fact that Greenwich and Hackney, which are also very deprived boroughs, no longer rank amongst the most inactive. So it's likely that the impact of local investment, the leisure facilities, improved green spaces, actually increase some of the access to participation. However, it was noted that a lot of these facilities can be quite costly. So the long-term impacts on community sport and local clubs were definitely questionable. I think the strains on delivery are directly associated with people struggling to afford to take part. So when we look at some of our institutions as well, we touch on the education system, we've slashed PE in schools, there's less playtime, there's less opportunities to be active, and childhood obesity levels are at all-time high. So whatever benefit came out of the Games, which I think is more evident in the actual localities where a lot of the Games took place, have been hugely impacted in probably the various crises we've experienced in the last few years since. So any legacy that may have been present has largely, I think, been swallowed up by COVID and the cost of living crisis now. So if we're talking purely about the impact on participation, I'd have to say, you know, what legacy, unfortunately. But how can we best encourage, I think, underserved groups to engage with sport and physical activity? I mean, it's another sort of contentious talking point because we're talking about groups that have less access, are more deprived. They experience a lot of barriers to participating. And in saying that, I mean, there are current responses at the moment. So for instance, I work at London Sport, we're partnered in rolling out some funding which focuses on children and young people in particular, but also wider communities trying to think about their family members engaging family in sport and physical activity. So for instance, there's the Go London Fund with the Mayor of London and opening school facilities as well, looking to open school facilities outside of school times. So the key here is to bring funding and make it available for local community organisations, schools, places in local communities to offer sport and physical activity opportunities, make sure they're embedded in the communities and safe and accessible for locals. So key things that can be done to make sure spaces are accessible and appealing to underserved groups are co-creating the sessions and programs with them. We have to remove patterns of people sitting in meeting rooms deciding what's best for communities. You have to go to the communities themselves and find out you know, what is it you would enjoy doing? Why don't you participate? What are your main barriers? And then only then can you start to sort of address these. There are, I think, a lot of governmental whole system approaches in increasing participation in these communities, but it takes significant funding because your environment often dictates like how safe you feel to go out for a walk or a run. If you live in an area of high crime or there's poor street lighting, antisocial behavior, it's less appealing. You don't want to go out and do those things, and it's impossible to get people moving in that way. It's also important to build, I think, physical activity into everyday life, something that I think you struggle to do with sport in some instances. So helping people understand that walking is free. They can do gardening. They can use the stairs at home to increase their daily step count, or, you know, get their rate of breathing up a bit. Some boroughs in London do like free gym and swim, which is great. But I think understanding representation is key. So targeting Black and ethnic minority groups, people from low-income backgrounds, women, LGBTQ+ communities, people living with disabilities, older people. Each one of these groups have different barriers to participation. So providing the free-for-all doesn't always work. And it doesn't work in a lot of situations. You have to target and make sure that things like marketing is representative of who you want to attend. I mean, I could go on all day about this, but I'll finish up there. But just to sum up, say, I would say that, you know, increasing accessibility by aiming activities at targeted groups where they engage with the planning is key to increasing participation for a lot of these underserved groups.
Thank you, Gemma. That's fantastic. I think there's some interesting things we'll pick up in the Q&A on the routes into improving physical health for everybody, not just elite athletes as well. Thank you. I'd now like to bring in Dr. Dion Neame, who is the North American Senior Medical Expert on vaccines at Sanofi. Dion has a passion for primary prevention of disease and regularly presents across Canada, motivating Canadians to improve their health. He's also a community volunteer, coaching and training and mentoring young athletes to appreciate the life lessons found in sports. Just as an aside from an ILC point of view, we do look to Canada quite a bit for the prevention work that Canada does, and the Canadian government spending their 6% of their health budget on prevention measures. So it's very, very interesting to hear from you, Dion, about what you think of the findings, and also how Canadians and perhaps US policymakers view physical sport and activity as a preventive measure.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks very much for having me. I will say I'm a little embarrassed that I don't have any of the medals that everyone else had, but I do want people to know that I did give it a go, and I took a good shot at it. I had everything going except for one thing, and the coaches were very clear about this. You're not good enough. But I didn't hear that. I heard you're not good enough yet. So that's actually why I ended up in medicine. I've been sciencing the daylights out of this, exercise, nutrition, and mindfulness, and vaccines. And that's why I became an immunization expert. But I've noticed that a lot of people have touched on the things that I was going to talk about. But I'll just go through it quite quickly. So the thought or the comment that I kind of picked up on was, while you're generally not able to take part in sports at the highest level throughout your life, the benefits evidently stay with you, long after you've hung up your spikes or your goggles. Well, I think that what you do when you're 20 to 30 years of age certainly isn't going to dictate what happens 60 to 70 years later. And what's been reflected on already is that it's the behaviors that you learn when you're trying to be an elite athlete. Those are the ones that become part of your lifestyle. Sharron, you just said you were exercising, you're just at the gym. That's the thing. I go down to I have a gym in my basement, although I don't deserve it. It's a very nice gym, and I exercise every morning. I watch Sports Desk, and I catch up on all the real athletes, and so it's part of my routine. And this is the thing. When you're looking at primary prevention of disease, there's exercise, there's nutrition, there's mindfulness, and there's immunizations. But the first three are very much part of sports, and the way people look at that is very interesting as well. So when you're an athlete, you look at exercise by how do I get quicker? How do I get stronger? How do I get faster? What are the exercises that I need to do that? Some people look at exercises sort of as, well, I'm going to go to the gym because I want to get bigger muscles or something like that. But, it's really not a very healthy way of looking at it. The athlete way of looking at it is extremely healthy. When you're looking at nutrition, a lot of people look at nutrition from the perspective of, I just want to lose weight. I want to diet. Whereas an athlete would look at it quite differently. They would say, well, what am I putting into my body? What are the micronutrients that I need repair my body when I've broken it a little bit down when I'm exercising? What do I need to do to repair it? Those kinds of things. And then, of course, the mindfulness issue is very much different. I think sometimes when you're looking at, I'm going to exercise to make my body look a good way, I'm going to, diet to lose weight, because you never achieve what you're trying to achieve. But when you're an athlete and you're looking at it from a very positive way, the mindfulness is, okay, well, what do I do next to get better? It's okay, I made a mistake. No, it's okay. It's perfectly okay to make a mistake. You can learn from your mistakes. And it's great to have mistakes and learn from your mistakes, because then you can improve. So you can see that the athlete sort of has a little bit different approach at what they're doing with their primary prevention strategies, their exercise, their nutrition, and their mindfulness. And I think that that's sort of the thing that can take you from 20 to 30 years of age and continue yourself in engaging in these behaviors for decade after decade after decade after decade. Okay, so that was sort of the first question, and that was the comment on that I was responding to. The second question I got was, how important are high-level events in inspiring physical activity in North America and around the world? Well, I mean, just from an opinion, I think they're extremely important, and I think that they're extremely important, the Commonwealth Games or the Olympics, because they really inspire us to go out and do physical activity and to understand how great it is to be out there, the joy of sports, the motivation. But that's at kind of the psychological level. Let's look at it from the physiological level. If you're inspired to go out and have sports and go and do sports, what's going to happen? Well, physiologically, you're going to go through some hormonal and neurotransmitter changes, which are going to be pleasurable. And we're creatures of habits. We do things that are pleasurable, and we do things again and again because they're pleasurable. So when you start to exercise, first thing that's going to happen is your adrenaline's going to get going. That's your excitement hormone. That's great. Serotonin is going to increase, and that's your happy neurotransmitter. And of course, endogenous endorphins start to release, because when you're exercising, it can be a little bit painful. You are actually breaking down tissue. I mean, you're breaking down to heal better. So the endogenous endorphins allow you to go through, to get to the next level of exercise, but it also allows you to sleep better. So it's during that sleep in which you then recover a little bit better. So if you can flick the first domino of you're inspired by a Commonwealth Games or an Olympics, if you can go out there and you can just do some exercise, the physiology will take over and you go, you know what, this is awesome. I really quite enjoy this exercise. Now, the third question was, do Canadians, US policymakers view activities as preventative health measures? And yes, they do. And I'm going to talk about the Canadian experience a little bit because I grew up in Canada. I am British, though. I want you to know that I immigrated to Canada, so I'm British just because everyone else seems to be. So yes, the Canadian government does look at preventative health as or policymaking in preventative health. And so there was two initiatives that they did while I was growing up that they're still doing, and there was one sort of philosophy. Now, the two initiatives were participation. And participation had to do with kind of, testing students every year in certain skills. But what they were actually doing was, sure, they were testing, but they were also teaching. So they had these they had these 8 exercises that you had to do. And they respected all sort of the different types of exercise that you could do. So for example, they had 50 meter, 200 meter, and 400 meter. And that was looking at cardiovascular exercise. And so they were sort of teaching you about cardiovascular exercise. And this is how you would improve in cardiovascular exercise. And then they had sort of these strength and resistance training. So this would be like 60 seconds to do as many sit-ups as you could do, or flexed arm hang. And so they were teaching you sort of about strength and resistance. And then they would ask you to do sort of these stretch or movement type of tests. And that would be sort of like long jumps. So you would have to get muscles and your bones and your ligaments together. And then you have to get your upper body and lower body, and you have to flow in motion. So they were giving you that type of exercise. So that was participation. And that was, yes, it was a test each year, but it was an educational idea. The second one was actually Canada's Food Guide. And so Canada's Food Guide was sort of like a micronutritional kind of approach, or maybe not a micronutritional, but a nutritional approach to feed your body to grow and to just get bigger and stronger. And so they looked at it from a perspective of, macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And then they looked at it from a micronutrient perspective in regard to vegetables, what vitamins were in there, what minerals were in there, milk, what type of vitamins, minerals were planted in there. And so again, it took a different approach at the way that you were thinking about nutrition. And it was, again, teaching you. So it was teaching you the whole time. And of course, the obvious end point was that people would learn, and then they would continue this behavior throughout their life. And sometimes it worked very well, sometimes it didn't. The third sort of thing that they did was more of a kind of a philosophy, more of a perspective. And that I touched on already, which was really a healthy mindset. They were really into kind of this positive thinking versus this negative thinking. And they use sports as an example. And I sort of used it already. But when playing sports, it's okay to make a mistake. A mistake is great because it's an opportunity to learn. Opportunities to learn are culminating into some form of improvement. And so that's sort of where they did. So they actually incorporated it in quite nicely. Now, when you sort of look at this in totality, it's kind of a cool thing, because you've got sports, high-level sports, Commonwealth Games, Olympics, inspiring people. You've got people then going out and doing some activity. You've got government policies which have taught them the way that they should be doing their exercise. And then in the end, you've got places like Sanofi, actually, which I'll talk about just for a second, who are actually working their way into improving health by, in my case, as a vaccine immunization person, they're developing immunizations so that people can get immunized so that they can prevent infectious diseases, which can be quite dangerous. We don't see them as much as we used to because of immunizations, but of course, COVID reminds us that there are bad infectious diseases out there. Sanofi's done something very interesting as well too. So being in the arena of primary prevention of disease, but not being in the exercise, nutrition, sort of mindfulness side, they actually are sponsoring the Paris 2024 Olympics. And then they put their money where their mouth was on this one too. I think it's something in the area of 93 million euros. So they really are taking they're taking a really good approach. If they can't help with certain things, well, at least they can sponsor things, and they're a premier party involved in the sponsorship. So I think I'll just leave it at that. I hope that wasn't too much too fast.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Dion. Thank you. And finally, I'd like to come to Scott Reid, who is the Deputy Chair of the Diabetes Working Party and member of the Health and Care Board at the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. Part of Scott's role there is developing health products using technology to improve people's health and well-being, on the basis that motivating people through sports and fitness is a great opportunity for the insurance sector and other finance sectors to truly engage and support their customers. So, Scott, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. Yeah, I was asked a few questions as well, just to talk about the report. I mean, first thoughts and findings from the report, and I think, yeah, what Les and Roy have done here, I think it's really trying to quantify the boost to longevity. I think that's the key thing in this report that's really valuable, because it provides evidence that sports does add years to life. And I know this isn't straightforward. Getting the data, you have to look at it over a very long period of time, and that is definitely a big challenge. So well done to Les and Roy for doing this. The other thing I was really interested to see is actually from the last report, they included track and aquatics in this one, and other sports. I think obviously I'm quite a passionate runner, so I was really pleased to see track coming into this, and it's good to see actually much higher sort of longevity, from these sports. Cycling being more dangerous, in some ways, it's a surprise it was, quite a bit below the actual population line. But also, I think in the report it does cover the actual improvements in the safety and training regimes over time. So I think that's quite an important point. And it would be interesting to see actually if you could take out the accidents, if you had that data, would you actually see cycling is quite good for your health as well if you can do it safely? Which I would assume it is. And coming on to this sort of grouping all the contact sports, again, I think in the previous report, boxing was quite bad for longevity, and I think grouping all these things together, overall, it was actually a 10% improvement in longevity. But I think it'd be interesting to see that broken down a bit more, because I think some of these contact sports might be actually very good for your health, but it'd be good to see a bit more, what's the variation in that. In terms of looking, so next question is around the findings from the two pieces of research, the report written 2 years ago in this report. linking sport and longevity. I think the two reports together do make it much more extensive and broader coverage of the impact of longevity in different sports. So I think it's great to see these sort of more intensive sports that have mass participation included this time, like running and swimming. And I also thought it was quite interesting when I looked at medalists. It doesn't actually matter if you're a gold medalist or a silver or bronze. It didn't really have an impact overall in longevity. So again, does that mean that actually if you do the training regime and you go through the process, like I'm thinking more about the general population, would you actually have the same benefits, coming through in longevity? And I think finally, I just want to finish with, was asked about what's the long-term trends for the role of exercise in the context of population aging. Now again, this is sort of more tricky because the paper and the report focuses on elite sports people, but the question is, does that extend to non-elite sports people in general? And I would say in the previous paper, Les mentioned this, that yes, sports such as tennis and golf are very sociable, can be played to older ages, and that could be quite beneficial to longevity. But I also know, like being a runner myself, I do know that actually whole general level of fitness, and it is sociable. It's good for your mental health, and you can also do that to older ages if you don't get injured. So again, I think that's all. I can see that it's been really important, and I think running, swimming, and cycling can all be part of your daily routine. I think people have mentioned it. It's got to be part of your habit and your lifestyle, and you can do this, into older age, which I think is quite important. So I think it'd be quite interesting to see the research. Is it habitual? Is this the thing that's really important? Is it the fact that elite sports people have the habits and they do these habits throughout their life, or do some sports people stop at a certain age and say, right, I've done it now, I'm not going to do any more exercise? I don't know if it'd be interesting to understand that a bit better. In terms of future research, to really understand the question about how does it impact, how does it extend across the population, I think you'd really need to look at a lot more data, wider data sources, like wearable data, for example, will start to become useful going forward. But again, even wearables, there's not a long enough time span, because Les and Roy have gone back to 1930s to get data. It's not, so again, at the moment, we don't really have that sort of big enough time span to really understand that. But I think the data that, we must have quite a lot of data there already. Some companies will have that in terms of wearables. It'd be interesting to understand actually what does that actually say now about people that run and swim and other sports over, over a period of time. And I think, just concluding, I think, I would say, this is sort of a personal opinion, but does this provide evidence on the role of exercise can play in improving longevity in general? And I would say this does provide evidence. Well, given the significant boost we can see with elite athletes, I would probably conclude that actually this is quite good evidence to say actually anybody that does that, goes through, participates in these sports, does the intensive exercise and the training and good nutrition, I think logically this does provide evidence that actually they would benefit as well. It's not just the elite athletes. So I'll finish there. That's all I was going to say.
Scott, thank you so much for that. And it's interesting, your penultimate point there reflects a question that is in the Q&A, and also a question from Ray Algar, who's the CEO of Oxygen Consulting, who worked with Les on this piece of work. And I think if I can come to Brian and Sharron first for their reflections, the questions relate to how those learned behaviours and how elite sports people first pick up their sport and how they get that dedication to it, but then also when their elite career is over, how they then move from that into, as Scott said, do they continue the physical activity? Do they go into other areas? Sharron talked about changing the sports that she does. But I wonder if Brian and Sharron, if you could just touch on those across the life course, how your work in elite sport has changed And then I think if I come to the other panelists, just about what the implications might be for us non-elite athletes. So, Brian, would you perhaps give us a few reflections on that?
Surely, obviously, you're looking at me just now and you're thinking elite athlete immediately. I can understand that perception, but I mean, I do genuinely believe that it's the behaviours that drive that's driving the longevity, and those behaviours are driving us to our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of what fit looks like. I'm now starting to understand what not being fit looks like. I've been in Parliament for 7 years, and it's probably the unhealthiest place I've ever been in my life. But I'm trying, I say that I don't exercise nearly enough. But while you were talking, I had a quick look at my Strava, and I realised I've done 21 exercise routines this month so far. So I'm trying really hard to get back to fitness again, but there's a mindset that is developed and ingrained when you're an international sports person, and things like even when we're not well or whether we're injured, we tend to understand how to look after that ourselves and how to look after our body ourselves. And I don't think you need to be an international elite athlete for that same sort of ingrained behaviour to get into any kind of sports person, which is why I talk about this need to open that door to allow aspiration to all of our kids. That, Sharron was saying her kids are into all different sports. I mean, this weekend or last weekend there, I took my daughter to an athletics match. Then on the Sunday I went down to watch my eldest grandson play rugby, and then my middle grandson play football. And that my eldest daughter was an international athlete. My middle daughter was an international athlete, now plays hockey. My eldest daughter was an international netball player. I still coach my youngest athlete. So it is a generational learning, and we pass that on. And I think that there's this idea that if you don't have parental involvement, how do we encourage that kind of behaviour? Which is why I keep them back to the school estate, and why we need to introduce that into the school estate. And that might then drag parents into that behaviour as well. But I think without question, for me, it is an ingrained behavioural trait that continually drives us on. And in my head, I don't know how you feel, Sharron, in my head, I can still do all those things I did 25, 30 years ago. And then I go and try it, and then I remember that was about 2 stone ago, and I don't do it anymore. But I'm still trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle. I'm still trying to, live as long as I possibly can, as well as I can, so I can annoy my opposition in here for as long as I possibly can. Sharron.
Thank you, Brian. Sharron.
You're on mute, Sharron.
Right, there we go. Thank you, everybody. That was so interesting from everybody's different perspective. I mean, what Gemma was saying about trying to get to different demographics is so important. What Dion was talking about, which prevention better than cure, is always something which I've been banging the drum on about for years. As I know that Brian will tell you, as an MP, it's really easy to show how if someone's sick, you can create medicine and you can fix them. However, if they don't get sick in the first place, how do we show that we're saving the nation money? And that is the problem we've got with always trying to implement prevention rather than cure, which is such a better thing because it's less painful and it's cheaper, but it's trying to get people to understand that. I think it's also teaching people about what exercise is long term. So for example, I'm a qualified PT, so I work a lot of the time with just, a middle-aged lady who wants to lose weight and get fit again. And so I talked to her about things like atrophy, which no one has ever mentioned that word to her, that actually as we age, we lose muscle. So we lose muscle, we can't burn calories. Things like core stability, the death rate for people in old age when they fall over and break a hip is huge because they have, they don't have the ability to repair themselves. But the reason they fall over in a lot of cases is because they have really bad core stability and they don't have the strength to be able to stay upright when one leg slips away. So these are all things which improves people the quality of life. It's not just about living longer. It's about those years being good years as well. So those are the things that I kind of caught up on as well as I was going through. Mandating. I'm desperate to mandate the UK government for leisure facilities. I don't know if this happens in Canada. I know it happens in a few countries in Europe. It certainly happens in Australia. We don't have that yet. We don't have a government that says, right, if you've got this many people living in this local authority, they must have a swimming pool, they must have a leisure centre, and we must make it affordable and accessible for everybody. And I think also that Brian is absolutely right. School is where we catch everybody. National curriculum in the UK says that we're supposed to teach all under 11s to do 25 metres. Well, we're not even getting 50% doing that at the moment. That's because it's not part of the Ofsted report, and it's expensive for schools to do it. And so therefore they know they can get away with not doing it. And it's always the areas of deprivation that suffer the most. Those kids that don't have the parents that will then go and make sure that they teach them to go and swim elsewhere. So this is something that we've really, really got to face. We've got to understand as well that teaching kids about exercise and sport doesn't mean that it's always got to be competitive, because there's an awful lot of youngsters that don't really want to be competitive, and that's fine because competition isn't for everybody. However, exercise must be. So we've got to start thinking outside of the box as to how we engage with everybody. So those were kind of my thoughts from listening to everybody speak, and it was really fascinating.
Thank you. And Sharron, perhaps a word from you on when your elite career was coming to an end, and when you were looking at going back into whatever normal means in terms of normal life. What was your approach to your own fitness, and how did you? I mean, were you scared of it? Did you embrace it? What was your mental attitude, and how did you relate that into what you actually took up as a physical activity afterwards?
That is so fascinating, because I was very interested to hear what Dion was talking about, with regards to doing his sport, loving it, and being told that maybe he wasn't quite good enough to do it to elite level. What happens sometimes with elite athletes who've been training 6 hours a day for 10 years of their life is they rebel, and that's exactly what I did. I literally, first time round when I retired at 18, which was ridiculous, I had a few years out and came back, but because of circumstances, I literally rebelled. And I was used to eating vast quantities of food and obviously training a great deal. And then I stopped all of the training, but kept on eating the vast quantities of food because that was what I was used to doing. So I put on 3 stone when I first stopped swimming, which most people never believe or think actually happened. So when someone says, well, you've never been overweight, it's never been a problem for you, you're an elite athlete, I go, no, that's not true. I yo-yo dieted for nearly 18 months and absolutely loathed it. And it took going back to sensible exercise and sensible food before it came off. And then I never made that mistake again. So, yeah, I think a lot of elite athletes have a bit of a weird turn, because you go from being incredibly intense to literally losing that routine that you've got, which is really strict. I mean, I had no time to myself at all as a kid, going to school, training 6 hours a day, sleeping, eating, racing, whatever. It was a very organized lifestyle, to literally having total freedom. And I did go a bit crazy. So, yeah, it's a really interesting question. And then it's coming back to it again. So, and understanding that I wanted to get back to where I was, the person I really was, the person that liked to go to the gym and liked to go to the pool and, liked to be proud of my routine in the gym and eating well and, being sensible. Also, the mental aspect of sport is so underestimated, the endorphins that were mentioned, and just the ability to be proud of yourself gives you the confidence to go out into other aspects of life. And that is massively underestimated in sport.
Thank you for that. Gemma, I wonder if I might come to you, because some of the things that Brian and Sharron have been talking about there, about the mental attitude, the self-discipline, but also the influences that must have been on them in order to for them to achieve that. From your work, how can we support people who are non elite athletes into getting fitter and maintaining it?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
Agree. If you know that, we'll just I'm interested in your thoughts.
I wish it was that easy. I think a big part of the problem at the moment is sustainability. We get these pots of funding that pop up all of a sudden to, throw a load of money at children to, let's say, get them more into sport, get them more physically active, and then it disappears. And unfortunately, everyone goes back to what they were doing before. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got our highest levels of childhood obesity at the moment. And in schools, there just isn't enough opportunity for kids to, do physical activity. But also thinking about things like PE, a lot of children have nightmares when they think about PE. They think they have negative experiences with it. So a lot of what, Sharron and Brian talked about were, having good experiences as a child and having that lifelong behavior then continue from there. So it's almost like we're missing just letting kids enjoy being active. You know, it doesn't always have to be organized functional, you know, sessions where they have to do a specific sport. Actually, there's a lot of people, when we do a lot of research and insight and find out what is it you want to do, a lot of people say, well, I don't like traditional sport because I don't want to be competitive. I do want to just enjoy myself. But, you know, I remember when I was a kid and we had to do the climbing the rope. I don't know if they still do that now, but you just have nightmares of that. There was always that one kid who just could not do it at all. And they had a night every time they thought about PE and talking. Sorry, were you going to say something, Paul?
No, I said that was me. That was the one,
I
right?
thought you were saying stop talking.
No, that was me.
But every time, you know, that kid thinks back to PE, they think of something negative, and they associate that with sport and all kind of physical activity. They just see it as something I really hated because there was someone screaming at me saying, you've got to do it, you can do it, you've got to do it, you don't have a choice but to do it. And in front of a load of people who might tease you about it later, the fact that you couldn't do it. You have to, you know, there has to be a range of things that people can do, because like I was saying earlier as well, things like gardening are now sort of accepted as something that will raise your heart rate. That is physical activity. It's not a sport, but it's physical activity, and that can be beneficial for your health. So we need to find the range of things that people are interested in and be able to offer those. And it's not easy because, like I say, there's not, you know, sustainable funding to do all of that. But prevention is definitely better than cure. And again, both Sharron and Brian touched on that social return of investment of sport and physical activity, and everything that you get out of it is, you know, so much more than what we're actually putting in financially. So, you know, if we started now, for instance, and you put a ton of money into it and thought about the sustainability of it, you wouldn't see the response tomorrow, because I feel like our healthcare system is looking for that silver bullet to solve all of the problems that exist. But actually 3 to 4 to 5 years time, maybe we start seeing the difference in some of that, you know, that strain coming off of the healthcare system, because people are actually living healthier lives.
Thank you. And Dion, you're actually involved in coaching people. Is there any reflections from you on how we get those behaviors ingrained and how we sustain them in other people?
Yeah, I think that it's about fun, you know, you know, even when you're getting cut from teams, it's fun trying out, you know. It is fun. And I think that certainly in North America, I think we've started to take a bit of the fun out of sports, and we're starting to see it sort of as, oh, look, I could have a job. You know, I could, you know, become an NHL hockey star. I could play in the NBA. And I mean, there are people, there's a lot, I mean, local folks down the road, kids playing NHL hockey. It happens. It just doesn't happen very often. I mean, you've got a much better chance of being a physician like myself than you do actually being a elite athlete like Sharron and Brian. It seems hard, but it's very, very hard to get up to the level. So you have to incorporate everyone. It has to be fun. I'm going to make a statement, though, just going to step away from that. Do you folks, because I'm a pediatrician, so we definitely have had, and everyone's talked about this, a decrease in exercise in children, definitely. Do you see what else is going on? There is an increase of mental health like I've never seen, ever. I'm convinced, because I'm a neurophysiology guy, as I mentioned a little bit about that with the hormones and all that. It's one causes the other. Brian, I see you raised your hand there.
I'm delighted to hear you say that. I am fed up saying things like this in the chamber to a bunch of unfit politicians who just cannot link these things together. They cannot link the reduction in exercise to an increase in obesity and type 2 diabetes and mental health. They cannot link that stuff together. It's more about, we need to shovel more money into the health service rather than say, we're going to take that money and take some education money, and we're going to create an environment where our kids can exercise aspiration and our kids can go in and discover other things about themselves. And in the process, by the way, your physical and mental health is going to be hugely improved. And somehow or other, we have to get that message across, because it ain't getting there at the moment.
Yeah, and it's simple physiology. You know, it's simple physiology. And this is why I don't understand. Maybe I'll leave it at that, but it's simple physiology. If you don't do exercise, you're going to get mental health issues.
Sure. Can I just add in as well? We live in a world where, you know, there are so many electronic gadgets and people's lives are becoming so much more sedentary that, again, that learned behavior as children just kind of carries on in life. And And we're breeding a whole generation or a couple of generations that have no resilience. And sport is a wonderful tool for giving, resilience. You mentioned it, Dion. You said about, failing, learning that failing is just an opportunity to learn, and that there's nothing wrong with failing. The best lessons I ever got in sport was when I got my ass kicked. I went back and I worked out, how do I make myself better? And this, what's the worst thing? Well, I lost the race. So what? I go home and I train a bit harder, or I read another book, or I do this, or I do that. Trying to teach our kids that there's nothing wrong with failing, and sport is a wonderful vehicle for doing that. And we do have to work on the mental health, and resilience is a huge part of what's missing in our mental health in youth today.
Thank you so much for that. So just coming to a couple of the questions in the Q&A. I think these are, first of all, maybe to Scott and to Les. So it's been reported on the BBC News that UK excess deaths in 2022 following the pandemic are the worst in 50 years. Is there any reflection there on how that has affected athletes? So is that lower or higher than the general population? There's a probably sort of post-COVID interesting question there about resilience to things like pandemics amongst those who are athletes. And secondly, probably a question for Les, the findings, was there any socioeconomic status that was explored as part of this report? And is there anything you can sort of add on that? And we might then come back to Gemma for her work on inequalities, if there's something that comes from that. So maybe Scott, could you address either or one of those, and then I'll come to Les?
Just coming up, the excess deaths thing, and we're seeing in the news. I mean, I think, there is a lot of, that is definitely a feature of the UK, what's happening in the UK. Now, some of that can be explained by disruption in the healthcare services, but I think it's more than that, it's higher than that. And it's also affecting other countries as well. It's not just the UK. So you are seeing, deaths. Now, I don't think there's been enough research to really understand exactly why that's happening, really, but it's quite, it is a bit of a concern that the deaths are so high. And it's not caused by COVID, it seems to be the after effect. It could be disruption of the health service, people not going to get the right treatments or medicines, or when the COVID lockdowns were happening. But it could be to do with disruption with the ambulance services, strikes in the UK as well. All these things sort of, make it worse. But I think it's more it's higher than that as well. But it's not just the UK; it's a phenomenon seen in other countries. So I think, So linking that to the sports thing, I think the people, well, in a sense, COVID sort of was a wake-up call a little bit, because people that were less fit, had underlying conditions like diabetes, for example, they fared worse, under COVID. So again, I think that should be sort of a wake-up call to say, actually, even to make the population more resilient to pandemics, fitness is important, to make sure people do have a good nutrition and not overweight, and they try to keep themselves healthy. Prevention, I think it's been mentioned by Sharron. So again, I think that's pretty key, that message from the COVID, I think, and I think the link. So that's the sort of link I would make. I think that sort of covers it. Does that answer the point, Paul?
Yes, I think so. And Les, if I could come to you on the question, there's a question about the socioeconomic background of athletes and whether that was factored into the report, because I think that does link into perhaps Gemma's work on inequalities and looking at which groups to target. So Les, was there anything on the socioeconomic background that you looked at in the report, or any comments there?
Yeah, well, how to address this? I think inclusivity is really important, and so sports should be accessible to all, whatever their background or education. And both Brian especially, but also Gemma, talked about inequalities, and inequalities are a barrier to access to sport. And we also know that people living in more deprived areas are more likely to be, for example, obese. They're more likely to have long-term conditions that kick in at a relatively early age, and gradually their lives close in on them because they're unable to do things. And I think this is kind of reflected in what we see in the excess deaths data as well, which I think Scott was referring to. People who are more vulnerable were more likely to be impacted than people who were fit, healthy, regardless of age. And I think the data sort of shows that in spades. And this inclusivity thing is, we probably think of it in terms of inequalities in the UK, but in the Commonwealth Games, of course, we have competitors from all over the world, and it doesn't take a lot of digging to show that the life expectancies in many countries are far lower than life expectancy in this country, and the inequalities, internationally speaking, are very wide indeed. And you also see this reflected in the medal tallies of the different sport participants. Having said that, you see some fantastic examples in some very small and not particularly well-developed countries or territories where individuals have done fantastically well. And these again are sort of highlights or lessons that we can learn from. The thing that Brian touched on, which I think is worth mentioning here, is that these inequalities and socioeconomic differences also impact on healthcare costs. And you find that people in more deprived area are vastly more dependent on healthcare. They're vastly more likely to be trapped into long treatments that span perhaps many years with regular visits to doctors and hospitals. And that can't be good for the country, can't be good for the individuals and or for the economy. And I think another point that Brian might have touched on is he was very concerned about healthcare costs in Scotland, and that's understandable. But my own view is like his, that with our aging population, healthcare costs are becoming almost insatiable, unsustainable, and this will only grow. And I think we're seeing that quite a lot, and it's reflected in the ongoing strikes in the NHS. Not directly, I agree, but it just shows you that we could reach a stage where healthcare is absorbing the almost half of the wealth of the entire country, which I think Brian mentioned as an example pertaining to Scotland. So yeah, socioeconomic differences are key to all of this, and that everybody should have access to sport. I think Sharron mentioned mandating swimming pools and other access to facilities. I'm concerned that is not happening. But somebody earlier mentioned music. I can't remember who it was, but I think that music might be going down the same track as sport in schools as well, with less and less access. And I'm not quite sure why that is. Are we abandoning all of these different things, and or are we sort of blindly going down a road which we will come to regret later on?
Thank you, Les. And I think Gemma, if you don't mind, if I can come to you, because obviously at Sport London, you're dealing with the capital and the many different boroughs and the diverse populations across there. What would be your policy asks? What would you like to see in order to get those to remove those barriers to sport and physical activity for those groups that actually could probably benefit from it more?
Just making sure again that there's, I think, equitable access. We've got 32 boroughs plus City of London, and each borough has its own strategy about whether sport and physical activity is prioritized or not. Some don't have people that advocate for it at all, or people that work within that areas within the local council. Therefore, it's very difficult to get things commissioned for their local population. So there are pockets of deprivation in pretty much almost all of London boroughs, really. You've got wards that are sort of IMD 1 to 3 in everywhere across London. So it's really difficult. But each borough, council is responsible for making sure that everyone within the borough has that equitable access, and they need to look at, okay, well, who's living there? You know, how do we get to them? Which is why I talked about bringing sport and physical activity back into the community, because we've got so many community assets that we risk losing. You know, Sharron talked about the swimming pools, leisure centres. Unfortunately, people can't afford to use them anymore, and because they're not being used, they disappear. So, you know, something has to be done to make sure that they're still there in years to come so that people can access them, can utilize them. We're removing that access barrier. A lot of it is monetary, unfortunately. So with this cost of living crisis, we're seeing people just say, well, I can't afford to do the gym. That's for, you know, middle upper class people. It's not for me. I can't afford to do it. So they cancel their gym memberships. And unfortunately, there we go. We have another person that's has a high susceptibility to diabetes, to becoming more obese, to being sedentary. Yeah, so it just needs to happen locally, unfortunately. Like, you can't just do a blanket response to it. Each locality has to prioritize, you know, some kind of physical activity and sport for their local, you know, people, and take a look at those demographics and figure out how do we engage each of these groups.
Thank you very much for that. We have a few minutes left. I think I think we've covered a number of questions that were in the chat there. I wonder, I'm putting you panelists on the spot, so apologies for this, but just to sort of wrap up, could I have one final reflection from you on what we do, one top tip to just get people more active, or what either individuals need to do or what government would need to do? As I say, this is not, I hadn't pre-warned you about this, but just to sort of wrap up. Sharron, I'm going to come to you first, if I may.
There we are, back on again. I think it is just trying to get government to understand that prevention is better than cure, and that they need to invest, and that we need to see that investing isn't about whether we can make a leisure centre make money. It's about the fact that that investment is investment in the people that use that leisure centre. So this isn't a commercial basis. This is something about investing in people and in their physical and their mental health. And I think probably, in all honesty, the most important place to try to get to people and to create those habits is schools. And we have definitely lost physical activity in schools. You know, they are so tight with how much, you know, schooling that they have to do, and so many things that they have to do to keep Ofsted happy and educationally, that we've lost a lot of those other curricular activities like music, like sport, have gone. Find things that kids want to do, whether that is competitive or not competitive. I remember a few years ago, we had the British women's hockey team. We were incredibly successful and everybody was absolutely glued to television. And I said, this is fine, but not every, you know, teenage girl in particular does not want to play hockey, right? Does not want to go, off you go, let's do a cross-country race. That's not what they want to do. So if it means that we have to put Zumba and music into school and dance class into school, and we put a hairdryer in the changing rooms because the girls want to do their hair afterwards, then that's what we have to do. We have to think outside of the box.
Thank you so much for that. Brian, may I come to you?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Sharron said. I mean, I think the battleground here is school. I think it's, you know, we have lost not just PE in school, but extracurricular activity in school. We are not linking school activity with what's available in the community. I've never understood why we would do 6 weeks of basketball in school and then enthuse your kids to play basketball, and then after 6 weeks there's nowhere for them to go. So why are we not linking up, you know, looking at the community, seeing what's available in there, and developing a curriculum around a pathway that allows the school to enthuse, and a pathway into that sport. I think the way in which we fund extracurricular activity as well, you know, we currently have a budget up here of about £45 million for sport. In the last manifesto, I asked for £250 million from the education and health budget to be put into sport, so that we could create that framework where kids have the ability to participate from a very, very young age. And I think Sharron will probably back me up in this, trying to get teenage girls into sport specifically, around about 15, 16-year-old, is nigh on impossible. We have to be getting them used to getting involved and participating when they're 3, and they're 4, and they're 5 years old. That's where the battleground is. So I think, you know, I'm in the middle of it. Quite frankly, I mean, I'm blaming politicians, and I've just realised that I am one. But it's a message that, I mean, I'm thinking about what I'm going to do next now. I'm going to put a motion into Parliament on this, see if I can get a debate on this particular topic again. Nobody disagrees with me in Parliament, but they do bugger all about it. And I think it's reports like this, I think, need to lead the way, if you like, rather than, I'm not going to listen to Brian Whittle in here because I'm the opposition, but we need to change the mindset of politicians for sure.
Thank you, Brian. Gemma.
I agree with exactly what the others have said. Everything they've said, sort of starting that behavior at a young age, you know, making sure that we're reinforcing the importance of it, making sure that the government are recognizing that it's an investment. It is. There's a social return that we know that we get back. Apparently, every £1 spent on sport, we get about £4 back. And that's also on productivity as well. As we know, it makes people more productive. People are able to go out and work because of skills that they've learned doing sport and physical activity, from being healthier, from doing sport and physical activity, from having good mental health and good physical health. So just to echo what the other two have said, we just need it commission, we need it in policy, we need the government to be pushing this agenda and throwing some money at it.
Thank you. Scott, over to you.
Yeah, I think, I agree with this, what people have said about making a habit of younger lives. I've got children myself, and I know, you know, what it's like. Grassroots isn't supported as it should be in different sports. But also I took up running sort of later in life. So I also think there's a thing to do with people, not just younger people. I think people of any age, I think it's just encouraging people to do more sports. There's some things that do happen, like park runs, that are great, I think, community things that happen, and people go along and they do the run it, they can walk it, you know, they don't have to run it. And these sort of things are great. I think, yeah, things like that, I think more of these types of things, I think would be good. Not everybody likes running, but if there's different things, different sports, and a bit more, I'd like to see a bit more money going into even making, like, even track events. You've got the Commonwealth Games and you've got Olympics, but apart from that, what are the big, making a lot more, maybe making it more commercial to give the athletes more money and to get a lot more people interested. You know, there'll be a lot more fans watching it on TV. The halo effect, people doing more sports. So I think there's a lot of things you can do, you know, even at older ages, to encourage people just to become fitter.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dion.
Well, everyone said such important things. I'm sort of running out of things to say, but what I would say, when I was actually at the Ontario government and they were asking me questions about vaccines, but they sort of got to healthcare and they said, well, what's the issue with healthcare? And I just looked at them and said, there's too many sick people. You know, and I left it at that. And it just comes to what everyone's been saying, right? I mean, whether it's exercise, there needs to be more, you know, whether there's, I think there needs to be more opportunity to exercise, not scheduled, spontaneous exercise. I walk by parks all the time, empty. And I don't know where that's changed. I guess it's PlayStation. I don't know. And that's like a big issue. How do we get people motivated to do that? Is it government that motivates people to do that? Or is it parents that motivate? But parents, everything's different now. Both parents are working. They don't have any time. It's such a different dynamic. I think it really needs to be looked at from that sort of we're different now perspective. If we're going to change the way that we behave, we're going to have to unpack that first, because it's not like when go out, get out of here, get out of the house, come back when the street lights are off. It's not like that anymore. It's changed dramatically. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. But the number one thing I think is there's too many sick people. We got to prevent.
Is it possible just to have one last line on that? Because it was so important what Dion said then. There is something that we've left out in all of this, and that is that there is a certain amount of personal responsibility that is not ever addressed. You know, and we've got to get to a point where we can try to get people to understand that it's not McDonald's fault that they're fat. It's not the television's fault that they're sat on the backside watching it all day. You know, we have got to start being honest with people that they have the power to make the changes. And then we've got to make sure the government are giving them the tools to make those changes.
Thank you. That's
Can I just add something, Paul, as well?
Yes, Les, I was going to come to you for a final thought.
Oh, fabulous. I just think this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I think it raises the bar quite a lot, and that I really do think we've got to keep the momentum up, possibly by doing more research. Scott referred to the difficulty of getting the data, but as Dion was talking, you know, the Olympic Games strikes me as being a really ideal data source that enriched this whole thing enormously by making it truly international. And of course, the Olympics go right back to 1900, the Commonwealth Games only 1930. Well, what we are seeing, which is really interesting, is a steady erosion in the health of the country, I think. I mean, just to put an sort of generalization here, and we're seeing that in all sorts of ways, which have been echoed by all of the discussants. And to get things done in the UK, I don't know what it's like in North America, you usually need some catastrophe or some change, something that changes outlooks, and you know, it might be the Grenfell fire, or it might be something else that actually leads to change. But it's hard to see what could lead to change in this arena, given that it's a steady decline in sports participation, or whether it's a steady decline in health. What's the wake-up call that will actually change the mindset and change the dynamic? So thank you very much, everybody, for a fantastic discussion.
Thank you for that closing thought, Les. I mean, just a few reflections from me. I mean, the influence of family and schools getting people earlier in and getting these learned behaviours. I think role models such as Sharron and Brian and all the others are vitally important in inspiring us, but then it is around what we can do for ourselves. And I think the policy asks around, I do like the idea of the mandating swimming pools and actually making that a proper provision for communities. I suppose the aim of all this ultimately must be that if we looked at back at one of Les's graphs, we want to be closing the gap between the elite sports people's longevity and our own longevity, and I think that's possibly the next challenge in public health and physical activity for us. So if I could just thank Les for his research, for Bayes Business School for sponsoring it, and for Ray for the co-production of the report. Thank you to our fantastic panelists this afternoon, Sharron, Brian, Gemma, Dion and Scott. It's been great to have your insights on this. At ILC, we've just launched our ticket sales for our 9th Future of Aging conference, which will be held on 7th of December. And this year's theme in the run to the general election is about ILC teasing out those solutions to ensure that an aging population can live better for longer. I'm sure the debate on physical health and how we can improve that is going to be an integral part of that day. We also have a busy few weeks coming up ahead with World Congress and Public Health in Rome and some G7 meetings in Japan and Geneva. Details of those are on our website, as indeed are all the details of all our forthcoming events, for which you are more than welcome to join us. We're also on Facebook and Twitter at ILC-UK, and it would be great to see everybody at our future events. But thank you once again to Les and Ray for their research and presentation. Thank you to our panelists for your insights, and thank you very much for everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at another event or webinar in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. See you now. Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Mm.